Hello and welcome back to the Stitch Witch YouTube podcast. I'm Ourielle, your host, and today we're going to talk about how I knit down an entire year's worth of stash. So I have my little journal here and I wrote down a couple of fun tips. What is it, like 13 tips on how I knit down like an entire bookshelf of stash. I went through a divorce, I moved, like I got through so much yarn. And unfortunately I don't have like before and afters, and I set up a spreadsheet like right before I left my channel and I did not keep that up after a while. So like I don't have numbers and pictures and stuff to show you, but I do have a lot of projects and like way less yarn and a lot of things that have moved out of my house. And so trust me when I tell you I have knit a full bookshelf's worth of yarn out of my life. I know ball, I know stash, I know some stash busting, and in the last like year or so I feel like I have produced so much stuff. Obviously this is not a game of production, but when it comes to actually using stash and getting it out of your collection, I know a thing or two, and I want to share some of those tips with you. Not all of these are going to be useful for every kind of person, and also all of this is predicated on the idea that like you are knitting to get rid of stuff. So there are a couple of givens that I want to get into first. One is that like knitting is a hobby and like Project Pan, which is the other version of this that I was familiar with in my other hobby, which is makeup, there is no amount of time in this world that would make it worth it for you to not enjoy the thing that you spend your time and money on, right? Like when it comes to minimalism, downsizing, conscientious consumerism, all of that jazz, you need to understand the difference between like something being worth it financially and something being worth it emotionally. And when it comes to your hobby and it comes to your interest, there will be a section where it's about value for money from a monetary perspective, and then value in the sense of like once it reaches the point of like not enjoying this thing anymore, you've now turned your hobby into a job or an obligation, and then like now it doesn't have value as a hobby. So for me it's important to like have you ask yourself the question of like, is this still fun? Do I need to knit? Is this like because I'm trying to not spend money and therefore if I want to knit I can't spend money? Those are questions that you're gonna have to answer for yourself. For me, I wanted to knit and I wanted to use my stash up, and I did not have the money for more yarn. So it was fairly easy for me to make the choice of like, I'm either gonna knit with stash primarily, or I'm just like not gonna end up having money to knit at all because I already sank all my money into yarn and I don't have more money lying around to buy more yarn. So that's the first given, is that like you've already weighed the pros and cons, like whether or not you even want to knit down your stash. Because if your stash does not bring you any joy, if you don't feel like there's any point in continuing, then just donate your yarn, do something else with it, or find a different hobby. Into the tips. Some of these are gonna be just like not that useful. So like one is knit your queue, like knit from your stash, knit from your pattern stash, knit from your queue. This is just the thing that everyone does, right? Like so usually we buy yarn, we have a project in mind, or we don't have a project in mind, but we buy a quantity that works for a specific project. Like I bought 5 balls to make a sweater, and then we don't knit that sweater. Your first order of business is just like knit the stuff that you said you were gonna knit that you didn't end up knitting. Sometimes it's because I'm not interested in that project anymore, or I swatched for that project and then it didn't hit gauge and I couldn't get gauge. I sized up, I sized down, I added a yarn, I subtracted a yarn, and for whatever reason it didn't work. Okay, we'll find something else. I think the easiest way to stash down large quantities of yarn is to just put it to work. And I think that's the least sexy thing to say. So like this is probably the least helpful tip, but if you can put it to your mind, I mean, you don't have to be disciplined in the sense that like knit down your exact queue. You can find new projects. And this is stuff that we do all the time. Take your yarn and maybe you wanted to do it for an original project and that project didn't work. Find a new project for it and then actually just commit to knitting it. This is just like a matter of discipline. So it's not a very practical tip, but that's what I did. I knit a bunch of stuff on my queue. I had a lot of projects that were sitting in my pattern library, and then I had a lot of yarn that I thought would work for a project that didn't work for that project, or I didn't like it for whatever reason. And then I just did a little swapperoo. After a certain number of years knitting, you develop a pattern library that is big, and then what you thought didn't work for project A might work for project J. Like now you have way more patterns and you can sort. And if you are good with your Ravelry usage, or if you're really familiar with gauge and stuff, you can figure it out. Number 2 would be to knit outside of structured recommended gauges. So for me, that might mean using a particular yarn in a combination with a needle that is not recommended for the pattern that I want. And this is somewhat about yarn substitution, but it's also about having a little bit of flexibility when it comes to not always following the rules. So I have a ton of Cascade Eco Plus, and I had even more of it last year. I already knit through probably 8 balls of that stuff, and the balls are 250 gram balls. So I'm dealing with probably, what is that, like 20 hanks, maybe more than 20 hanks of regular 100-gram balls of yarn. And that's because these are just like massive balls, and they didn't work the way I thought they were gonna work. And I bought some, I was gifted some, and on top of that, none of it operated the way that I thought it was gonna work. So I had to be creative with my usage. I had to find a way that I enjoyed using it. I had to find different patterns that would work for it off label, so to speak, like not what was recommended. And I got through it. And it happens really slowly, and it happens over the course of like years to work through, because it's a lot of sweater quantities of yarn. But if you are willing to not do what the label says, you can maximize both your yarn and your patterns. My next tip is to gift knit. For those of us who have random single skeins, and I don't mean leftover skeins, that's different. Like if you have scrap quantities, I have a tip for that. But for skeins where you're like, I bought one of these as a souvenir yarn, or for me, my entire first year of knitting, I just bought yarns and I didn't know really what to do with them. And I didn't really understand how much yardage I would need for stuff. So frequently I would buy 3 balls of yarn. 3 balls of yarn is still not enough if you're not knitting with like fingering weight yarn. If you're knitting with like worsted weight yarn, 3 balls of yarn is still like kind of an awkward amount of yarn. And I didn't know that. So I just had a whole shelf's worth of yarn that was strange quantities. You know what that's good for? Accessories and gift knits. I know everyone always talks about that, and this is not like a super, again, it's not groundbreaking news, but come the holiday season when all of a sudden I need 20 different hats, or I need hats and I need cowls, all of a sudden it becomes really easy to give to people things that are made of like one-off skeins, and that's a really good use of getting rid of some stash. Again, not a super sexy one, but I have knit a lot of I have knit a lot of 2x2 hats. I've knit a lot of weekend beanies. I've knit a lot of cowls. I've knit a lot of the Andrea Mowry like asymmetrical seamed up cowls. Like some things are just really easy to knit and gift knit, and especially with like awkward lengths of yarn, that might be a really good one. And for me, clearing my stash of these like random 2 or 3 balls, like 400 yards here, 400 yards there, 300 yards here, like those are really annoying quantities, and it's really useful to get rid of them through gift knits. And I don't mean get rid of as in like you don't care about this thing, you don't care about the person. I mean finding a perfect application, yarn, pattern, person, right? And finding a really, really good, like thoughtful combination of those. It is really fulfilling. And there's something really satisfying about going through something that you already have, pairing it with a pattern that would be perfect for someone that would really love that thing. Super satisfying. And all of that being from stash clears out some mental space, clears out some physical space. I really enjoy that process. And so although it's not a particularly innovative tip, I do think gift knitting is a fantastic way to get through stash. I got through so much stash myself, gifting and gifting and gifting, and over like a couple years where it's like holiday gifting and then birthday gifting, you end up going through a lot, which is great. The next tip is to be willing to experiment with different color combinations. So I think what happens for me, again, because I have oddball quantities where it's like, I would love to knit just a purple sweater. I don't have enough to just knit a purple sweater, but I do have enough to knit a purple yoke, or I have enough to do contrast trim, or I have enough to do stripes, and we'll talk about that later on. But there are different things that you can do to combine colors that you normally wouldn't love together. And I think that's actually part of the reason why I like stash. I like taking stuff out of my bookshelf and combining different color combinations that are not usually done. I have a whole Pinterest board dedicated to those color palettes. I also love color palettes in general. I personally only buy yarns and colors that I like and I would wear, which means that undertone, brightness, chroma, all of that is designated for me and my personal style, or the person that I'm making it for. But like when it comes to stash, most of it is for me. And I think that's really fun. It's really interesting to play around with like nasty, dirty color combinations. One, because now people find your work interesting and artistic and very intentional. And 2, it gets those oddball skeins out. And we'll talk about that later, which is specifically things that are good for stash busting, specifically odd numbers. So the color combinations you're gonna have to get used to, but the other thing you're gonna have to get used to is not having full quantities for stuff. I just had to be very comfortable with the fact that I don't have 50 sweater quantities worth in my stash. If you are that person, then only tip 1 is gonna apply to you, which is like knit from your stash and don't buy new yarn and have discipline. If you're like me and the reason why you have stash is because you have all these like weird quantities of yarn, then you're gonna have to get creative with stripes, collar work. Adding in motifs would be another one. So like finding a stitch dictionary and like adding a couple things here and there so that you can spruce up not only like a plain piece, but also use some of that stash. That's gonna be your friend. So learning that skill of color work, learning how to put color combinations together, learning to like stripes, or learning to like intarsia, like whatever the thing is to get you to use those oddball quantities, that's gonna be your friend. or to buy new yarn to use up old yarn. And this is something about the novelty piece. If you are, like myself, somewhat blind to the yarn that you have because like you've had it for so long, or like whatever, like I bought this 5 years ago, it's just sitting here, it doesn't feel special anymore. Maybe it doesn't feel special because it's not combined with something new, or it's not special anymore because you've just seen it for a long time and you never found a good project for it. Add a new thing to that, and then all of a sudden you're really excited for a new project. That for me is oftentimes the case, specifically with yarns that I realize are not that flattering, or specifically with yarns that I don't like working with when it comes to like full textures. Like I don't like chainette yarns. I don't like fluffy yarn that's like a blown tube with like stuff on the inside. Something about that texture is really, really difficult for me to manage, and I didn't know this, and chainette yarn is often a really amazing composition and it's a good price, and like there's so many companies that make beautiful, beautiful blown yarn. I cannot stand it, and so I didn't know this until I bought a lot and what happens is I need to find a way to use it. For me, I can tolerate it in small quantities, so I'll do it for colorwork yoke sections, or I'll do it for contrast ribbing, or I'll do it for certain other crafts, which we'll talk about later down the line. But finding ways to incorporate new and old together can then make stuff interesting and tolerable if you have like an issue with that. Shop your stash for like a little curation. That's my next tip, is like pulling out little kits that you are interested in for the season. So like I have a color palette, I have a mood board, I want to do this for the season. So for my season, I'll show you what I have for right now. These are the colors that I'm really interested in, and it's springtime, so I'm like looking into that right now. Going into my closet and pulling out yarns that are already sitting there means that I get to shop for my stash. If I need to incorporate some new stuff, I can, but like hopefully a lot of that color palette is already sitting in my stash and I have stuff that I can work with, colors that are inspiring me, things that I want to add. And because knitting is a slow craft, you can be really intentional about this, and realistically, you're not going to have all that much stuff, and it can be fun to just like narrow down a couple of colors, a couple of ideas, just focusing in on one or two things, and it'll be enough for the whole season. So you don't have to be so overwhelmed. For me, sometimes it's like, yes, I have a color scheme, and yes, generally there are colors I like and I don't like, but there might be specific aesthetics that I'm interested in. There might be specific textures that I'm specifically interested in. There might be yarns in my stash that suit those specific things, and I can pull those out and work with them. For me, I'm usually motivated by color, but I know some people are not as, you know, motivated by color, but they're more motivated by texture, or like their range of color is smaller, so it's more nuanced in terms of like the kind of specific color they're interested in. Maybe you wear a lot of blues and neutrals, but like now you're really interested in a specific kind of blue and a specific kind of vibe, and just really getting into the artsy like curation sense of like, we're gonna do a capsule and it's just gonna be a limited focus. Sometimes that gives us the clarity that we need to move forward without feeling like way too overwhelmed. My next one in terms of improving your stash output just has to do with improving your output altogether, which is to have a project for every kind of instance that you're knitting in. For me, knitting is my primary hobby. It's what I do most of the time, and it's also what I do to like deal with my autism. I have a different video on like why knitting is super compatible for autism, but it's also my stim. So I have knitting for all different kind of contexts. I have knitting for when I really want to focus. I have knitting for when I want to do something with a chart. I have knitting for when I want to enjoy color and I have like a visual thing where I really want to like stimulate the visual senses. I have knitting that requires a little bit more rhythm, so like lace or textured knitting. I have knitting that is just in the round. I have knitting that is big. I have knitting that is small. I have knitting that is flat. I have knitting that is not flat. I have knitting that I don't need to look at, that I can do in the dark or while I'm talking. I have knitting that is extremely transportable that I can do while walking on a treadmill or walking around the block. I have blanket knitting for when I just want like something big and cozy and to like wrap myself up in. I have small circumference knitting. All of that is so I am always working on something and producing something. Now you may be someone who like doesn't want to turn yourself into a knitting factory, and like you can do this at a smaller scale. But for me, when you're asking like, what can you do to get through stash? Having something that I can do all the time has made sure that when I knit all the time, I'm knitting stuff out of my stash all the time. And what that also means is when I have 7 projects on the needles, some of those are gonna be new yarn. There's always gonna be some amount of new yarn, or like maybe there isn't, like right now there is, and there has been. But also a lot of that yarn is stash. When you're dealing with so much yarn and so much knitting at all the times, you have a greater chance of using up old stuff. You have a greater chance of casting on projects that you already immediately have yarn for in your stash and you're not going out and buying new stuff. And this is kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, or like you build momentum as you build the muscle of like going to your stash first and trying an interesting combination and then like feeling like you have a project going on. it feels good to then like keep going. Oh yeah, I used that in my stash. That was really creative. I didn't think that I was gonna like that combination. What else can I knit from my stash? And so, you know, the way to use some more stash is to knit more, and to knit more from your stash. Obviously that's not gonna be like revolutionary information, but when you can include more knits in your day, like maybe you have a commute that you previously weren't knitting during, because like it's not easy and you're in a car and like it's a small space or whatever, but then like all of a sudden you learn to knit socks, and now socks can be your commute knitting, and you have a lot of sock yarn. You can find little pockets where like the thing that you are trying to fill a hole in can then be filled with a stash project. And I do think that that's really useful. For me personally, it was really useful to have many different projects that suited many different environments, so I was never empty-handed. I am almost always knitting, and I don't really have pain, so that might be part of it. Like either something about my ergonomics is better now, but like because I can knit, because I have so many different projects, there's never a time when like, oh, like I couldn't knit my sweater because I don't have the chart with me, therefore I can't knit out of my stash, right? Like that's almost never an issue. So there's always some kind of progress being made. Some progress is always better than no progress. The next one is to learn a craft that might use up more of your stash. This is like maybe good, maybe no good, but like for me, crochet and punch needle are two that like are really useful for me. I love crochet because some things are just better in crochet. Like I think there's nothing that beats a crochet blanket. Rhythmically, I love crocheting a blanket. It's fantastic. I love crocheting granny squares. Again, because you get to deal with all those different colors. I think that's really fascinating. I also learned to punch needle. Punch needling is really fun, and guess what? You get to use yarn. So for me, a lot of materials that I didn't like in the past, like different cottons, different polyesters, or acrylic blends that I didn't really like because they felt stuffy or whatever. And this is different for each person, right? Colors that I don't necessarily like wearing because I found out that the color looked different in the image versus in real life, and I don't want to make that sweater out of that color anymore, and I don't want to pay to like send it back because it's perfectly good yarn, and I don't have a gift to knit that's that big. Great for punch needle because I can use it in something and hang it up on the wall, or I can gift it to someone, and it's not that big. So find a different craft for the yarn. The only one that I haven't tried is like weaving. I've also done spinning, so plenty of sock yarns I actually use to ply my hand spun. So basically the yarn is like half commercial, half hand spun, and I think that's a really good way to stretch your dollar and to stretch your hand spun into more yardage. That was actually a tip that I learned when I first learned to spin, which was like, oh, if you want to ply your yarn with something like more reliable, you can use a commercially spun yarn, and that will give your hand spun some strength if you're not super confident with like plying your own yarn with just hand spun. So all of the yarn that I used for that was also from stash, and I've plied yarn and it was fantastic, and it also gets me to use up some stuff that I haven't really had a use for before. So yeah, sometimes there are other hobbies that you can use that are more suitable for practicing new skills or using up your stash and being just a little bit more creative with some odds and ends that may not be suitable for your like regular knitting day-to-day life, right? My next tip is to gamify and track your progress and to have some kind of like way to document progress and the way to kind of reward yourself for a job well done. Knitting is a hobby and like you should like it. So if it's starting to feel like a chore and homework, like maybe KonMari your space and like make it so it's enjoyable. Like, but for me, having a stash and working down that stash is kind of its own game, right? There's a game of like acquiring yarn, getting it at a right price, like finding it in the wild, getting it because someone gave it to you or whatever, and then like having extras as you finish projects. All of that kind of accumulates and builds a stash because like entropy, whatever, right? We understand how that works. For me, what really helps is bingo. What really helps is documenting my progress. That can be writing about it in my journal, in my knit journal. It can also be this YouTube podcast where I show you what I made, whether it's in stash or not. I also document in my little project notebook whether something is made with stash yarn or not stash yarn. And for me, that's also really helpful in seeing at a glance, did I buy yarn for this project? Or was this yarn that was like sitting in my stash and I'm making progress towards my goal of like not having all this stuff piling up. So all of that feels really good. And again, like gamifying, like we like games. And for me, bingo is really a fun way to do it. I'll show you my bingo board now. I'll put it up on the screen. And this for me is a way to stretch my artistic and like my creative muscles a little bit and to get some of those like diverse knitting goals out into the world where I'm not actually just like thinking about those things, but I'm actually implementing them. But it also includes like maximizing stash wherever possible. I think it's easy to forget, like we buy yarn because we like the yarn and we want to use it. And I think there is a piece around stash losing some of its shine and then regaining it as you put it into a new outfit, you put it into a new project, and then it really shines in its new capacity. Yeah, it's great. I think I have found a lot more success once I started tracking and like looking at specifically, was this made from stash? Was I reaching for my library first, as opposed to like going out and buying all new ingredients? It's kind of like cooking, right? Like sometimes you need to buy new ingredients, sometimes you don't have to buy new ingredients, and it's nice to know that like you're clearing stuff out of the pantry, or you're doing the like stuff that's in the leftovers in your fridge and making a brand new meal out of all like bits and bobs, and finding that to be like really fulfilling. I want to say generally, I don't focus on things that are scrap. So things that are like less than 1 ball of yarn, those can be a little bit more difficult to deal with, and I put those aside for later. I have a lot of scrap yarn that is that quantity, less than 1 ball. When it comes to anything that can be made into full projects, do those first. And it doesn't really matter whether you start with 1 skein projects or garment style projects. Obviously, speed wise, you're gonna have to look at your own preferences to see what you like. But for me, I don't really worry about scrap yarns until way down the line after I've accumulated enough scraps to make something else. And there are scrap projects, like there are blankets and there are sweaters and there are all kinds of things that are designed to use up small amounts of yarn. But for me, 100 grams or more is usually where I start to like whittle down that progress. One of the best ways that I found to work on like medium amounts of yarn are to make these little project bundles, kind of like yarn kits where you would find at the yarn store. You find a pattern, you print out the pattern, and then you make sure that that yardage and everything works for that particular thing. So that way there's always some kind of like go bag option for a quick shawlette or a mini scarf or a hat or mittens or socks. Like there's always some kind of kit that is available for you. And I like to do like 1 a month, 1 little accessory or like 1 little project a month that is not part of my regular garment construction routine. But this is going to be really different for each person. So I'm leery of saying like, oh, you should put together kits, because plenty of people also put together kits and then mentally don't consider that yarn as part of stash, and that's what's stopping them. So if you're the other way around, where you've already designated a lot of items as kit projects and you haven't used them, maybe consider doing the opposite. Maybe consider taking those out of those kits and putting them into your general stash and thinking of bigger things you might be able to do. So be flexible with your thinking, but for me, not worrying about like tiny scraps is really helpful, because like that's an entirely separate ballgame, and working down bigger quantities has been useful in like just pushing the needle forward and making progress. My next tip is to follow designers that seem to make designs that are good for stash busting or scrap busting. There are a couple people that I follow that explicitly, or maybe not explicitly, but like, you know, implicitly work with a lot of stash yarn. There are a couple designers I can think of. One is Rose Knitwear, another one is Picky Femme, another one is Summer Lee if you like knits, another one is Loopy Studio, Amazing as Grace, La Pole is another one. Ame Life is another one who is Japanese, but she seems to do a lot of like single skein, artistic kind of stuff. Tom Daly, I think, also, he has some designer patterns. All kinds of pattern designers who mix and match, have a more eclectic style. Those designers might actually have explicit instructions on how to do color changes, how to mix textures. I know Rose Knitwear, I have her book. That one in particular gives you a lot of information on how you can specifically add things, play with texture, play with different widths, play with your needle size, what works well together, what doesn't work well together, and then also visually you get the language of like, what does it look like to use scrap in your work. Similarly, I would say start looking at designers, and I don't mean knitwear designers, I mean like actual fashion house designers. Take a look at what that kind of like more bohemian artsy look might look like, more of a punk look, more of a DIY look, more of just like an eclectic look. It's probably like the opposite of petite knit and My Favorite Things Knitwear, even though if you're including like stripes and color work, that's gonna be good for like your scrappy stuff. But I'm talking about more of a rough hewn, organic, wabi-sabi kind of like, there are parts that are imperfect, and part of that imperfection is that like we ran out of yarn. I actually really like that aesthetic when it's done well. You're gonna have more or less preference for that depending on the kind of person you are. But for me, having a visual library in my head of like versions of this in high-end knitwear, high-end fashion, gave me permission to kind of experiment more, right? It also helps if you're more willing to try different colors. And I don't mean colors as in like, wow, everything is different colors, but colors as in like, you're just not having to do everything in one color of yarn. So sometimes that means like a shawl that includes many different colors, but the colors are subtle. That's also fine. So I'll try to show a couple of examples here of things that are colorful, scrappy designer ideas that are going to include options for you to use many, many different balls of yarn with more or less visual noise, right? So like that way you can use more of your scrap, that way you can use more of your stash, and it's not requiring like 10 balls of the same stuff. Again, this is speaking to my particular issue of like, I have a lot of yarn, but not enough quantity to finish easy projects with just like one type of yarn, and so there's a consistent look. If you don't have a consistent look, then you're gonna have to be creative with like finding inspiration, finding projects, finding patterns that allow you to basically mix and match your yarn. And so yeah, the input is really important. Having to fill your cup with other people's creativity and seeing other examples of that will help you. It'll help you to like build the visual library of like, oh, it's okay for me to not have everything be one color. It's okay for me to change things out a little bit. And for me, these are some designers and these are some ideas that have really helped me. Another tip that I have is understand fabric characteristics, fiber characteristics, and how to manipulate them. So for instance, silk I started knitting with, linen I started knitting with, cotton I started knitting with, and many times the yarn is actually quite uncomfortable, or there are parts about the yarn that you don't like. Maybe for alpaca, it grows too much, or you have a superwash yarn that is just like absolutely untenable and it just like grows and grows and grows, right? All of those things sometimes lead me to drop a project because I'm like, oh, this is not the thing that I thought it was gonna be, or it is not enjoyable to use, or whatever. When you are knitting and then you reach a roadblock like that, it's really easy to be like, well, I wanted a summer shirt in this particular fabric and I didn't end up getting what I wanted out of it, and so I'm not gonna continue and I'm gonna use a different yarn. Okay, well, what do you do with that pile of yarn? For me, I start combining it with other types of yarn to compensate for what I'm looking for. Kind of like when you're mixing colors and you want to neutralize a certain color, you're gonna find its opposite. If you have a yarn that is really, really rigid and you want some flexibility, you might want to combine that with a yarn that has more bounce and more stretch, because that way when you knit with it, you're not gonna just deal with roughness on the hands. So there's a lot of ways to combine things into your own hybrid. Like, of course, some yarns are already blended with different fiber characteristics, but you can also do that. You can do that different strands together. So for me, that includes usually mitigating plant fibers with wools, or trying to compensate for alpaca's like lack of structure. But for me, being able to blend different quantities of yarn and quantities of fibers together, understanding the different properties of different fibers, that was really instrumental in getting through a lot of those difficult yarns, basically ones that hurt my hands or ones that were, I don't know, were itchy or scratchy or uncomfortable. Like, there is almost always a way to compensate for that. And for me, that helped me get through a lot of quantities of yarn. Last but not least, always be interested in what is available. For me, that is just like keeping up in the space, watching videos, being on Ravelry. There are always people who are doing pattern roundups and showcasing items I've never even seen before, and that's always really lovely. But it's really important, I think, to always, again, be filling your cup with new stuff. You can have all the inspiration in the world, but if you don't have a pattern or like the know-how to get started, then it's gonna be difficult to actually do the thing that you wanna do. And I cannot tell you how many projects I was able to start only because a perfect project came up that used the exact quantity of yarn that I had, or if I cobbled together a certain color scheme, oh my God, that's perfect. Now I can finally get started on something. I have a blanket that I've been meaning to start for the last 6 months that I wanted to use around like, I don't know, 1,200 grams of yarn for, which is like a significant chunk of yarn, right? But I just couldn't find a pattern that was gonna be the thing that I wanted for this thing, right? Like, I just wanted a particular look for this particular thing and I just wasn't able to figure it out. And yesterday I found the one. And it's because I spent a lot of time engaging with free patterns online, engaging with yarn companies that are producing all these like free patterns for us to use, all kinds of stuff. If you're on social media, you'll see lots of different inspiration. Again, just sometimes it's a matter of not having the options. And when you are kind of more immersed in the space and you can see how many options there are, how many different examples there are, how many ways you can be creative, there is an unlimited number of things that you can do to make things more or less comfortable for you. And that has been really fun. It's been very liberating. It has gotten a lot of stuff out of my stash, and I'm gonna start that blanket today. I'm really excited. And hopefully these tips were useful. Again, this is what I did to knit a bunch over the last year, and the majority being from stash. And this year, 2026, I've knit a ton already, and most of that was from stash. There's very, very few projects where like nothing I have is from stash. And I think that's just because I finally have a grip on what I can do to maximize my stash usage, maximize like my creativity, kind of like not allow my knitting mistakes to just become like specters of the past that haunt me. You know, like now they're things that I can take and utilize. And if it really is just like not sparking joy and it's making my knitting a chore, I just donate it. I get rid of it, and or I trade it, or I mean, I haven't really sold yarn, but like there are ways to deal with yarn if it's like genuinely not fun anymore. But for me, this has been my soapbox. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it helps. Again, knitting from stash is really, really fun once you like learn the little puzzle pieces, but it shouldn't be stressful. So that is everything in terms of my scrap stash busting routine. And it's kind of like weight loss. Like, it's simple but not easy, right? Like, in the same way that knitting from stash can just be as simple as like knit from your stash, don't buy new yarn. Some of those like little micro routines are the things that we need to actually help us achieve that. Hopefully this is a good place for you to start. I would love to hear what you guys think. If you have a stash, if you don't have a stash, I am kind of working through my opinions on like whether or not I want to continue having a stash. I'm gonna aggressively knit down my stash this year. I'm gonna continue on this trajectory that I'm going on because it's great. Like, I don't have to buy yarn. Oftentimes I have yarn, so that's nice. But at the same time, I don't know if I want to knit it down to 0 or down to like a very small amount of stash. So TBD on that. I might do a video exploring the ideas of like stash. I might brainstorm that and do that next. But yeah, there's pros and cons to both. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.